All right, let's get started. Welcome to Broker Chat, July 2020. How's everyone feeling? I see
Wonderful.
Stephanie. I hear wonderful. Great. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. I named this version of Broker Chat Shifty Business. But before we get started, if you're new to this call, this is a twice a month Zoom presentation that your qualifying broker, Tom Fulkerson, and I am the managing broker in the Midtown office. We put this on to help you guys kind of weather through the market, weather through your contracts. We get constant calls. So when we see a repeat offense, so to speak, we try to talk about it so that we can educate you guys on what we're seeing, different things that could possibly trip you up or you be tripped up by other agents that may not have the luxury of good training like this. So with that being said, of course, you know me, I always have a PowerPoint. So I'm going to jump right into our Shifty business and talk about some things. If you're kind of newer in the business, meaning I would say, Tom, would you say like 5 years or less? Probably 5 years or less. You probably have never experienced any type of shift. 2020 was a shift because we had a pandemic and we had to all work from home and jump on Zoom and do things a different way. We're now going into a shift that you've not really seen happen, and that's the interest rates going up. You're probably not getting as many offers on your properties as you were before. And so you are used to appraisal gaps, and maybe that's not something that is working for you as well. And so I want to share some of the things that you have available to you already with your GAR contracts, with your special steps. And then, of course, I'll leave enough time for you to ask questions, or if there's something I'm showing you here, or Tom, if you want to add to anything, please feel free to jump right in. All right, we can still see my screen, yes?
No.
Oh, you can't see?
No, we just see your beautiful face.
Okay, well, let's try this again. Well, it can't be all about me today, although it's okay. All right, how about now?
Now we can.
All right, beautiful. Let's get back to this. Where are we? I'm going the wrong way. There we go. All right, so Shifty business. Let's get started. Of course, I always say the slightest mistake could end up costing you money and stress and a tarnished reputation, and that's why you're here today, so that doesn't happen. We're going to talk about some best practices in the special steps section and in the forms section for this market ahead. There's talk on television about recession and so on and so forth. Are we in one? Yes, we are. No, we're not. It's coming. Bubbles, all that. Take all of that off the table and just be prepared with the tools that we have. So that way, when you notice a specific shift, you know what details, what special steps, what forms you need to start getting very familiar with if you are not. The fact that there's a combination of high buyer demand, that's still happening. In some markets, it's still, probably in most markets, a seller's market. The thing that has changed the most is the interest rate. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Since January, our interest rates have gone up pretty much every month, sometimes weekly. And now we're in July, and there's a good chance they're going to go up again. But this gives you an overview of how quickly we went from 3.2 in the first quarter all the way to 5.6. And I think we're somewhere around that 5.7 or 5.8 was the last thing I saw. Did anybody see anything different? Anybody see 6 yet? Yes, no, maybe?
Sorry, I just took a bite of the sandwich.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, so everybody's still seeing 5. So that's good. Now, what I want to say about the interest rate, before we all were enamored with 2s and 3s, it was 5. So when everyone's starting to moan and groan about 5 and 6, 5 and anything under 10, anything under double digits, you guys, in my opinion, is still good. Because even people before me in the business we're used to seeing 12, 13, 14, 15%. My first home was 8%, and the rate was really something like 12. And I got an FHA loan for 8%. And I thought, hey, I'm cooking with grease here. So you have to put things in perspective when we're talking about the interest rate. What you probably have also noticed is that I'm just going to use this as an example that I have right now. $1 million buyer has now called and told me we need to go to 850. Okay, due to the fact that their interest rate has gone up. All right, so what can you do to bulletproof your contract when you have this fluctuation of interest rates? So how many of you knew that we had a special stip about fluctuating interest rates? Anybody knew that we had this? Jason's raising his hand.
No, ma'am.
But who is that? Mika knew. Anyone else? They've probably been to my class, and they've probably gone to other classes, and they probably have read their contracts to know the answer to this. So let's look at special stip 510. If you don't know where this is found, when you go into GAR contracts, you have an index of special stips. You have the index telling you what special stips you have, and then you have another one that breaks out into the paragraph of each special stip. So this one says that a buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that the interest rate on the first mortgage loan may fluctuate between the binding agreement date and the date of closing. Notice it says, from binding to closing, something could change. All right. Accordingly, buyer agrees that notwithstanding any other provision to the contrary contained herein, a loan with an interest rate not more than 2 percentage points. 2. Can you change the 2 to 1? Can you change the 2 to 3? Yes, we can change anything in the contract, but our contract committee usually will say, you know what, 1 to 2%, that's reasonable. Anything higher might not be reasonable to that buyer, all right? And if that happens, then the buyer will accept that. So let's say they had a 3 when they started, but it ends up at 5, which we did see from January to June. If they qualify for that interest rate, they're not getting out of this contract. If this special stip is not included, guess what? You see this arrow right here? This is where you're putting the interest rate when you're writing this up as a buyer's agent. And if you're a listing agent, you need to be looking at this. Are they putting a reasonable interest rate? We all know it's somewhere around 5. You shouldn't be accepting something that says 3. Because guess what? If they don't get 3, they get to get out of the contract. Okay. And if you put this special stip and they still qualify for the 5, they're not able to get out of the contract because they said, we qualify for the 5. They may not like that new rate and go, well, no, wait a minute, I don't want to pay that much. Too late. They should not have accepted this special stip. Any questions about this? And this is on all of the financing contingencies except for cash, of course. So it's on the VA, it's on FHA, and of course, I've put the illustration here for conventional. Any questions about how to use this? And do you understand what I just said?
Deborah, I'll tell you from doing contract review, I'm legit still seeing conventional loan exhibits that say 4.5.
And go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that I don't think agents truly understand the power of this section, whether they're representing a buyer or the seller, and what that means.
Yeah, it's powerful, you guys. And I, having started real estate in 1996, this was a common thing to use. This has to be dusted off and used. Don't you agree, Tom? It has to be dusted off because this is what's going on. This is part of the shifty business or the shift that we have, this fluctuation, and we keep hearing through news, through real estate regs, that the interest rate is going up. It is going to go up between now and the end of the year. How much, we don't know, but some people speculate 8%. I don't know. It just depends on how the government decides to fix all of this. All right. Thank you for that, Jason. So I'm also hearing a lot of problems with I'm sending offers over or I'm sending a counter offer over. I've had this a couple of times and I'm not hearing anything back. I'm not getting a confirmation. The agent is just giving me verbal and my client doesn't believe that the offer was even presented. I want you to know that this was a new form that was introduced last year, the request for confirmation of presentation. The one thing I don't like about this form is that it's not coming from the seller, it's coming from the other broker or the other licensee. But what they put in here is that we have a responsibility as realtors, as real estate agents, to send back a confirmation, whether it be yes, whether it be no, whether it be maybe, whether it be the seller is not going to respond to you. And you notice I have a note here. It says the seller may tell you they are not going to respond, which they have the right to do. However, you as a realtor do not have that luxury. And it's spelled out right here on this form from the National Association of Realtor and GREC that we have a responsibility to counteroffer or not counteroffer, but give a response back to the other party. And it's just good business. And so I had one this weekend where the agent was very frustrated in our office because the other agent from another brokerage said, we're not going to send you a counteroffer. I'm telling you what it is, and this is what they want. And even though he requested and sent this form over, that agent refused to send it over. So was the refusal coming from the seller or was the refusal coming from the agent? That causes me to have to call the other broker to light a match under that person to do what they're supposed to do. When you have this situation, you should send this form over if they're refusing. And then that's also an opportunity for you to give myself or Tom or whoever is your broker in your office to call them. And thank you, Barbara. Would you like to unmute and reiterate on that? Barbara's spelling out what I have highlighted on this form. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, hey, Keller Williams family, hey, Tom and Deborah. That is a violation of our Code of Ethics, Article 3. And as a matter of fact, I just want to take this opportunity to say, guys, be really, really, really careful because this month I've got an enormous amount of grievances that I have not had in a very long time. And that just tells me that we are getting a little sloppy and careless. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Barbara. And I love having Barbara on here because she's got her finger on the pulse of what's happening in our boards and especially on the grievance committee. And if you notice, she did say it is a violation of Article 3 and standard of practice 1.7 and 1.8. So when an agent is violating this with you, maybe you need to remind them, especially if they are a realtor, that they are violating this, okay? All right, moving on. Did you know that if your buyer or maybe even the seller, but mostly buyer, asks you, the realtor, a question, what is your first move? You will typically pick up the phone, call the agent or email them and text them and say, I should have said not pick up the phone because you guys don't pick up the phone. You text and say, hey, does this property have rental restrictions? Or do you have the HOA minutes? And so on and so forth. And so the frustration happens that you don't get it or you're ignored and so on and so forth. Well, if you remember in our purchase and sale agreement, there's one important line that is something you should always remember at all times, that things are to be in writing. And if there's ever a grievance or a complaint to the broker, and I don't have anything in writing, Tom has nothing in writing, we're going by, you guys are always in the transaction, we're not. So usually when someone calls me, they're in the middle of a sentence and they've left the front and the back off and they want us to be, mind readers as to what you've gone through. If we have something in writing, then we have a paper trail. You've always had this form. I don't know how long this form has been around, but it's always been around, F325. You could put the information on here. It's coming from your buyer and not coming from you. Okay, and then it's going to the listing agent for the seller to give you an answer. You can see question here, answer here. Now, some of you might go, oh my God, another form. But as you just heard Barbara say, there's a lot of grievances and we're getting sloppy because people are not giving the answers, or I'll tell you the one I'm seeing most, they're giving the wrong answer. Example, investor buys a property and they are told in FMLS there's no rental restrictions. Shame on the buyer for not doing their due diligence to make sure. And then they move in and start renovating. And the neighbor says, oh, are you the new homeowner? No, I'm the investor, I'm going to be renting. Oh, we don't allow rentals in here. That has happened. I could probably count on one hand how many times that's happened in our office. So this is a better way to put something in writing. Look at some of the examples I put: rental restrictions, HOA minutes and assessment, technology questions. What I mean by that, we live in a technology world and people have Nest controls, Ring doorbells. You know, I don't know what's behind the wall. There could be surround sound when you lick the wall or something like that. I don't know. But if you don't know and they ask you the question, this is a great form to use. So get it in writing. Was anyone familiar with this form? Has anyone used this form besides me? No? Good. Amy, you have your hand up. Go right ahead.
Yes, thanks. Does the form need to be used, or can it just be an email?
You can use an email. This is not an official form that you have to put with your contract, but if you notice, it says broker information disclosure. So all forms, we have what, 357 forms or something like that. Most of you, I know I haven't, will never touch all 357 for obvious reasons. But if you want to include this in the contract, you can. If it's just an informational form, you can. Or if you'd rather just email, you can. What did we learn from Tom's talk last week? Text is not a form of communication. Okay? Phone calls, not a form of communication when it comes to the contract. Does that answer your question, Amy?
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking. All right, appraisal determines the price and the right for the parties to terminate. So we've been so used to using that appraisal gap and paying over, you know, in my professional opinion, I don't think, and I guess this would determine certain areas, of course, that buyers should be offering so much more over ask. As I've said before, and as I've taught, a lot of this market is propped up by buyers paying over what it actually appraised for. So all the seller sees on Zillow is the final number. But for those of us that are on the street, we know it really appraised for 400, but my buyer decided to pay 50,000 over. And so the end price was 450. The house is still only worth 400. Okay. But because of the magic of numbers and skewing, people believe they can now put their house on the market for 500. Chances are the same thing will happen again if the house is not, you know, up to speed for that higher price. So in the event that your buyer says, you know what, let's say it's, this is another example of a question I had this weekend. The house was being purchased with cash. And I was so excited to hear that the buyer wanted to do an appraisal and was going to determine the price of the property based on the appraisal. And that's what they wanted. And the agent didn't know exactly how to handle that. And I suggested this because in the event the buyer, I'll use that same example again, offers 400 and it comes back 350 and everyone agrees to this special stip, then they can get the house for 350 if everybody agrees. And you can fill in the blank for the percentages and so on and so forth. However, if you don't do anything, and this particular seller didn't want the buyer to do an appraisal, they were not going to accept their offer if they did an appraisal. And that's because we've conditioned our sellers with all this waiving of contingencies, waiving of appraisals, waiving of financing, waive. Okay, and that is a problem down the road because we also have a lot of buyers that have a lot of regret now that they didn't do an appraisal or they didn't do an inspection. And now they have to sell and the market is shifting a little bit in price point. How many of you are receiving emails from your colleagues? If you've been around for a while, you're on everybody's mailing list. How many of you are seeing back on the market, price reduced, new price? I'm seeing it. That's a sign that we're not getting that 20 and 30 and 40 and 50,000 over. If you want, in my professional opinion, if your buyer still wants to offer over ask, do it. But does it have to be $20,000? Why not 1,000? Why not 3,000? You might say, well, Deborah, we won't get it if that's the case. Maybe, maybe not. I always believe terms are stronger than the number. Stephanie, you have your hand up. Stephanie Cauldron, you have your hand up. You have a question? Is she frozen?
I think she's frozen, Deborah.
Okay. I see her trying to, well, she's got her hand up. I see her moving, but she's not saying anything. Stephanie, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi was dropping, so I had to switch to another Wi-Fi.
Okay.
So, for example, with this special stipulation that you just shared with us, what would we fill out on the purchase sale price of the contract? Would we write C stipulation 606 or?
You would put this in, so if you wrote a purchase and sale agreement under special stip section, you would put this special stip. So you would do this at the offer.
So what about on the first page where it says purchase sales price?
Well, whatever your buyer is offering. So let's say the price, let's keep using 400. Say the price is 400 and you put 400 on the purchase and sale, but you put this special stip. What this does, it overrides that 400 in the event it doesn't appraise.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. All right, kick out provisions during the due diligence. So we're also noticing that a seller wishes that the buyer would go away so they can take an offer that came in after them. And of course, that's a little unethical unless you have a special stip that says, seller shall have the right to continue to offer the property for sale in the event that the seller receives an acceptable offer to purchase the property. Seller shall give the buyer notice of the same. Buyer shall then have blank hours, not days, hours, could be 48 hours, but hours after the receipt of the notice, which by the way, you would use a notification form to tell them. And then they would either decide to drop out of the deal, or they would say, no, I like the house. I'm going to finish my due diligence and I'll move forward. Okay. This is to be used during the due diligence. So don't let your seller believe that after due diligence is over, another offer comes in, and we know that we all must present all offers at all times. Then that could be a backup. That's when you encourage that buyer agent to become a backup. But if that buyer is under contract and they're still in due diligence and you get another offer that your seller says, oh my God, I like this better, then you might want to add this special stip. Again, this would be added at the offer during the negotiation, not after the fact. Binding is binding. Okay, so this would be one that you would use during the offer to say, hey, I already know that the seller, we just put it on the market. You're the first one to send us an offer. Seller feels like, oh, we haven't been on the market long enough. I might get 35 offers. Then you want to use this kick out to give them that opportunity to say, oh, I like this one better. All right, any questions about this one? Good. Repairs made by the seller during the transaction. I don't know what's going, well, with all the waiving, we don't have as many people running into this problem, but for those of you that are advising your clients well and saying, don't waive that, go ahead and do the inspection. During the transaction, this has come up, and we actually have had to file E&O insurance claims on this more than once, where the seller said, I'll do the repairs, and they might get you know, 3 men and a hammer to come and do it, and they don't have any kind of bonding or license or anything. And the work or the repairs, your buyer says, I would like a specific type of person to do the work. Well, that's going to be spelled out in your due diligence request. But you also want to tell them that, you know, we want the seller to obtain permits or certificates of completion when you have those type of situations. You won't have that for every situation. So if you're a newer agent thinking, oh, I should use this every time, use this with discretion, because some things will require a permit. You know, the seller says, I'm going to add a deck on the back. In certain counties, that might require a permit. So therefore, you want to make sure you ask that. Or if you look at an investor's renovated property and you want to know, did they get all the proper permits and certificates, especially if you're representing the buyer? That's something you should be doing during due diligence, not waiting until you close, buyer moves in, and then they find all these problems that were covered up, mold covered up with white paint, and now it's bleeding through, and so on and so forth, because people think they can just clean mold with bleach. It's a little bit more detailed than that in some cases, depending on the severity of it. Repair or replace named items after closing. This is the obligation of the seller when they haven't completed. So a couple of weeks ago, I had an agent that said, we put that we wanted the repairs to be done 10 days prior to closing. And of course, the seller didn't do it. It became a big thing at the closing table. I think how it ended, because I don't always get to hear the endings of stories. You guys come to us, but we never get to hear the ending of the stories. But in this particular case, I believe that the seller ended up holding back money at the closing in order to get these things completed, because they had already breached the contract, did they not? They were told to have this done 10 days prior to closing so that the buyer could do their walkthrough and verify that those things were done properly. But the seller didn't do that. So that, number one, was a breach, and they should have been notified. Anytime someone breaches, that's what the notification form, that's one of the reasons you use the notification form. You send that and say, you are now in breach per page, whatever, paragraph, whatever, spell out what the breach is so that everyone's on notice that you've breached and you need to remedy that breach. Okay. Repairs by seller after the loan approval. So a seller might say, well, that's a significant amount of repairs. I don't want to bring in, 3 men and a hammer and then you back out from your financing contingency. So this special step says, we'll do those repairs after we know you have a loan approval. And that way we know we're on our way to closing. Now, this one's a little funky because it's only talking about the loan, but it doesn't say anything about the appraisal. And I think when this was created, it was really meant to talk about that the loan is approved and the appraisal's been done. That is my interpretation of that. Does anybody have a different interpretation about this? Because I think it's when they're talking about the financing, because they don't say anything about the appraisal, and that is part of the loan approval. No, I'm thinking they mean when they say this loan approval, they're talking about both the financing and appraisal. And if you want to add on to this special step, you can, to make it very clear. And then in the event that they don't do that, then they have so many days to remedy that, or they waive that, seller waives that right to, or the buyer waives that right for the seller to do those repairs, because the buyer would have breached and not given notice that the loan has been approved. Okay, walkthroughs. How many of you do walkthroughs? I hope everyone on this Zoom call does a walkthrough. I suggest at least 2, one prior to closing and one the day of closing. And if you find out that there are some items that are not completed, then you have this special step to use, and you would send this. Now, this wouldn't be in the purchase and sale agreement at the beginning. This would be an amendment. So you do your walkthrough. We have a form for it, F-252. And then if everything is not completed or to the buyer's satisfaction, you would then do an amendment and add 332. All right. Lender required repairs. This is in our purchase and sale agreement already, but this is just another special step that can give the option for buyer or seller to pay any excess amount. And if the parties do not agree in writing who shall pay the excess, then it can be terminated. Guy, you have your hand up.
Yes, hi, thanks. I've got a question. I've got a condo that's going to be a cash buyer. I'm the listing agent. And there's a window that's cracked that will not be able to be repaired before the closing. Is one of these special steps on maybe on the repair request? Would that be appropriate, or is there something else to basically acknowledge that the seller is responsible for the window repair, but it'll be done after closing?
You would probably use the one that let me see if I can go back. So repairs made by seller during the transaction. And then you would probably do an amendment. Hold on, let me go back. Probably this one. So you have a window that's cracked and you want to make sure it's done before closing. Is that what you said?
No, it won't be done before closing. She's going to do
won't
it through her insurance, so it's going to be after closing.
Oh, okay. Then you're going to use 312.
312.
So
Okay.
that it'll survive.
Okay, terrific.
So you need
Thank
to do
you.
an amendment and use this special step.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. All right. Unfulfilled conditions at closing. This happens, I think, on a daily basis in every office. Buyer and seller agree that buyer or seller did not complete the following prior to closing. And then for and in consideration of $10 and other good valuable consideration, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged, it is agreed that the items referenced above shall be completed by, you would mark that box, within certain days after closing. When I get this call, most agents haven't looked at this special step and they're saying to me, what do we do? When they write a special step, you should always say to yourself when you write a special step, what, when, where, how, and what happens if. And the most neglected is what happens if. You guys do a good job with the what, when, where, and how, but the what happens if is always seems to be left off. And the what happens if in this particular special step says that the seller within blank days after closing. You don't want to give the seller like to infinity when they're going to come back and fix something. So when you have situations of holding back money at closing, if the attorney is willing to hold back some escrow money, then what I typically will say is you need to have this done within, depending on what it is, also 7 days, whether it's calendar days or business days. And then what you want to do is say, oh, by the way, if it's not done, that $5,000 that the attorney is holding is coming to my buyer and we'll just get it done ourselves. Okay. But if the seller is paying for it, then they should have a certain amount of time and a deadline. And what happens if they don't meet that deadline? And again, this is a special step that would be used on an amendment. Okay. And that's for unfulfilled conditions at closing. I think everybody on this call can raise their hand and say this has happened to them at some point. Yes. All right, notification. It's the least used form and it's important. When you have a breach in the contract or something that you need to notify the other party, whether you're the buyer side or the seller side, what you typically do is text it, email it, call it in. And then when there's a problem, and Tom and I have to follow a paper trail, there isn't one. It's just he said, she said stuff. And everybody wants to send me their text trail. Well, we don't need your text trail because the text trail means nothing to us. It will prove that you did have the conversation, but it won't hold up in court. Okay? So notice you can use it for breaches. You can use it, obviously, if the earnest money is not delivered when it's supposed to be. Tom talked ad nauseum last week about earnest money because it is the most important thing for the qualifying broker to make sure that we are handling that properly, we are notifying it properly, and that could be his license, my license, your license, the brokerage license, when those things are not handled. And that is why he talks about the earnest money so passionately, and I agree with him on that. So when that earnest money is not delivered, which both parties should be checking, and because we do this whole wiring thing now, it makes it difficult. When I started, it was a check or maybe even cash. We could follow that. But with the wiring thing, people just assume, oh, the attorney received it or the office received it, and you're not getting a copy of that. Now, I know in command, it says that that's one of the things in compliance that they want to see a copy of, whether it's a copy of the wire receipt, a copy of the check received, or however that person is paying their earnest money. But if they breach and it's not there on the day that the contract stipulates, then you need to send a notice saying you are in breach. Now, your next question might be, is the contract still good? Yes, it is. They're just in breach. Okay, and that needs to be remedied. Because if the deal falls apart and your seller says, okay, they breached, I need earnest money, and we don't have earnest money, and Tom talked about that at least in 2 or 3 of these broker chats. That is a really big thing that's happening a lot. I'm not sure why. And I think I stressed in one of my broker chats, stop with all this 3 days from binding and 5 days from binding for earnest money. When we started in the business, you got the earnest money before they even got in the car. So just make them wire the money to the office or the attorney that you're going to use. And if you don't write a contract or they decide not to buy, that earnest money can be wired back to them. So that's a good practice. Don't be afraid to ask for that. I hear a question.
It's Mika. So,
Hey, Mika.
hey, if they are in breach and the contract is still valid and it's not remedied, what is the next course of action?
I love this question because all of us as brokers get the question all the time. And I think we get the question because you guys don't want to face the reality. That's called a lawsuit. That's called a lawsuit. So it is really in our best interest to get that money as quickly as possible. And oh, by the way, in the last broker chat or contract class, I don't know which one it was, you may even want to say, we're in this market where we're getting multiple offers. You should be looking at that earnest money section. And if they want to win the bid, you tell them, if you want this bid, you're the bid we want, but that earnest money needs to be deposited now, not 3 days from binding. Because those are the ones that do their due diligence in 1 day and cancel, but the earnest money was due in 3 days. And I think Tom gave an example of that last time. So what needs to happen, to answer your question, Mika, is that earnest money needs to be deposited as quickly as possible. I don't know where this 3 came from. I see it a lot. Jason, what do you, is Jason still on? I think he was on. He does a lot of contract compliance in our office with Darcy. And I don't understand where this came from. I don't teach it. I don't teach, 3 days. No one even looks at the first sentence that says at the time of offer. What's wrong with at the time of offer? Why are we going to section 2 and saying, oh, let's just get in the car and look, I know you're good for it. We'll get the earnest money in 2 or 3 days. Why? Now,
Because they don't have checkbooks.
well, I get that, but and everybody's rushing. But let me tell you what that looks like. That looks like you're working with a buyer with no money. And as a listing agent, that looks like you're accepting an offer with a buyer who has not put any skin in the game. Does that make sense to everyone? I just put that in perspective. So then your seller's upset with you as to why that didn't happen. And oh, by the way, here's another reason why Tom does not like the earnest money held by the attorney, for many reasons. But think of it this way. What does the contract say about earnest money when who's holding what do they call the person who's holding the earnest money? The holder. And if the attorney is holding it, who has to give notice when it bounces or it's not delivered?
The attorney.
Right. And how often do you see that happen?
None.
Because they're busy closing transactions. When it's held with the broker, we know it happened, it bounced, MCA tells us that. We know it wasn't delivered because you're checking to make sure it's been delivered, and you can immediately do that notification. All right. I see a couple of questions on the chat. Let's see if there's somebody. Jason says, what if the attorney is not willing to hold the money? So on the 511, 510, and 511, we have instructions that you should go through and read because it gives you timelines. And if that attorney does not sign that form saying we'll hold the earnest money, there is an alternative holder on that form. Most likely you're going to put the office. And if you do, then you send a notification. Hey, everyone, attorney did not respond in 3 days that they will hold this earnest money. So therefore the buyer is now turning that earnest money over to Keller Williams. That's a notification and an amendment.
Hey, Deborah, that was in regards to the seller repairs post-closing.
Oh, okay.
So what if the attorney doesn't want to hold money post-closing?
Oh, okay. So you know what? You've got a dispute. Everything is not a real estate answer. Some things are going to have to be a lawsuit. And sometimes everyone's screaming lawsuit is kind of silly when we're talking about $3,000 earnest money or $5,000 earnest money, because we all know an attorney is going to eat that up in 2 seconds. So you're either going to sit there and work it out together, or they're going to have to go to court. All right. Vendors list. This one has been an issue in our office a few times. We had to file an E&O on one of these and we ended up winning, but it, you know, if you don't know about E&O, we pay for it every month in our monthly bill, and think of it as your malpractice insurance. You know, you make an error or an omission and the consumer has the right to file a claim, just like an insurance claim on your car if you hit them. All right. We don't make a decision on that. We have people and attorneys that look at all the evidence and then they make the determination, just like your car insurance will look at whether you paid your policy and whether you got a ticket, and they determine whether they're going to fix your car or only fix part of it after you pay your deductible. So that's kind of how E&O works as well. So Form F834, why I think this is important, because all of us have vendor lists. We have vendors in our market center that we recommend. Maybe you even say, they painted my house or they did some work on my house. That's all well and good. But when the person doesn't do a good job or a shoddy job or didn't pull permits or whatever you want to put, they're pissed at you. They want to sue the office. They want to sue you. And we get the complaint call and on and on and on and on. This form, if you put this on here and you give this to your buyer or your seller to say, because they're going to ask you and say, hey, do you have anyone? Yes, I do. And some of you may even go above and beyond to call them and do all these different things, which I don't recommend, because if it goes horribly wrong, you're going to be the one on the hook, or at least for the complaint call. So use this form. And if you notice, I highlighted where it says furnishing of any names of vendors provided by the broker or the broker's affiliate licensee, that's you, is done as a ministerial act and only as a, what is that word? Courtesy to the undersigned, and does not in any way constitute the warranty or representation as to the quality of the vendors that service or their subsequent reports. So termite inspectors, home inspectors, if you're working with investment property and you recommend a contractor, your buyer's buying a house by an investor and they didn't do something right, and you say, well, I've got, you know, Jane and John, you know, with a hammer, and they can come over and do it. You want to put this on here, and then you see it has a signature. Who signs that? Anyone. Your buyer or your seller, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So you notice I put a few things: our home lenders, our escrow services, our contractors, our using earnest, any property management companies you use. This is just good practice. This is just good practice. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with the shift? Barbara already said it earlier. She's seeing more grievances, and Wiseman said it, or Ned said it last time he was on here, that the court cases of log is getting higher. People are blaming others, and you've got to protect yourself. And I'm showing you those things you can do. Okay. Reminder.
Hey, Deborah, can I make a comment?
Sure, go right ahead, Tom.
You all need to start making sure if you're giving out references that you give more than one reference. I'm getting a lot of issues lately where somebody bought a house a year ago and now there's an issue and the agent only gave them their one preferred home inspector. All right, that creates a lot of issues for not only for the agent, but for the brokerage. So I'm just putting it out there. We're in a shifted market. You need to make sure that you're giving out. Traditionally, it's always been 3 names, and let that buyer or seller choose out of the 3 that you have provided, but don't give them just one, because it could come back and bite you in the butt.
That's very true. And guys, even if you give them 3 and you have a favorite, there's nothing wrong with saying, I have experience with, you know, Jane and John, but the other 2 are just for you to be able to talk to them yourselves and see who you like better. So just make sure you do that. So I like the idea of giving 3. We've gotten a little bit lazy just doing 1, and we need to get back into, you know, some typical things we used to do. This is one of my favorite forms, other than the instructions to the closing attorney, is F-264, to remind everyone of all the dates in the contract. It's also good if you have a transaction coordinator or an assistant who watches over your transactions, so that, and the attorneys and lenders love this because they can kind of get a snapshot of their deadlines. And if you're not using this, you really need to use it. I know in our command, it is a required form, I believe. But if you're not using it in your market center, I would definitely do that. All right. The ABCs of agency. And Brenda, I saw your hand. I'll call on you in a second. The ABCs of agency, understanding real estate brokerage in Georgia. When you went to pre-license, you may not remember, and I'm just a freak of nature that still remembers pre-license. One of the things they said to us is, by law, let me say that again, by law, let me say it one more time for the people in the back, by law, we must explain agency before butt hits leather. Did everyone hear me on that one? I'm finding and I'm hearing from compliance that people are taking someone out or writing contracts without explaining any kind of agency as to how they are represented. And I'm having sellers, or buyers, I should say, not sellers, buyers call saying, I don't want to work with that agent anymore. I've never signed anything with them. And I've already written a contract over here. Meanwhile, the agent's calling saying, well, I sent that to them, or I did this, or I did that. And I will ask, well, how did we represent them, customer or client? Well, I haven't gotten them to sign it yet because they didn't want to sign it. When someone says they don't want to sign something, it's because they don't understand it and you didn't explain it, period. Because in 25 years, I've never had anybody tell me they didn't want to sign an agency. They're either signing a client or they're signing on as a customer, but I've never had anyone refuse me. And I hear that so often, and I'm not sure why, but that tells me either you're afraid to tell them that they have to be represented in some way. There's nothing wrong with that. When you go to the doctor, you sit in the lobby and you fill out paperwork with saying, you will do this, you won't do that. This is what they have the right to do. This is what you don't want them to have the right to do before they put you in that room and that robe. So if before they get into your car, why are you not saying, in the state of Georgia, I must explain agency before we do anything? And give them this. The contract committee has put a perfectly good brochure together for you to give to that person. And when I teach contract class, I usually specify make all of your brochures in a zip file, and you can send that to the buyer or the seller. You can let them know all the brochures won't apply to you, but this is a file that I'm giving to you of important brochures that may or may not pertain to you. Okay, but this one is important because we as the brokerage need to know how we're representing the person who has the transaction. And oh, by the way, if they decide they want to cancel it, they can in writing, but they have to have, it's the way I think you guys are approaching it, not you guys on this Zoom call, but the others, that they're not explaining it. They're not saying, this is how I work, I'm running a business, and in order for you and I to work together by law, I have to explain agency. Are you familiar with agency in Georgia? No? Let me give you this brochure and let me go through the different agencies. That's it. That's the script. You should side-eye them a little bit if they don't want to sign it. What are they up to? And they may not be up to anything. They may say to you, well, I signed before and this person did this to me. Then find out what their hesitation is. Maybe they don't know you yet. Maybe they don't know if they want to work with you. Great. Let me do this. You're going to get 1 day of freebie. We're going to go out. I'm going to show you these properties. And then at the end of the day, we need to determine how I'm going to represent you. And here's the difference between the two, what I can and cannot do. Okay? And when you tell people what they can't have, they want what they can't have. And they'll sign. But you've got to give them a chance to get to know you, to read the form. It could be 1 day, but if you're rushing to do it, then you end up forgetting it. And then everyone wants to be forgiven during compliance because they didn't get it signed so they can get paid. And we're cracking down on that. Consumer brochures for investment properties. I don't know if you've seen this one. I think this is new. What new landlords need to know about leasing property. I only stuck this one in here because we have so many people out here renovating and investors that are buying investment properties. Maybe your client is a first-time landlord, and it's just a good brochure that you could give to them. I also think it would be a great touch in your database. Okay. So here's a favorite of mine. I think now it has become common for an agent to call me about another agent in a transaction they're having difficulty with, and they all start off, and they're not unique. It's funny to me because it's like there's some class being taught somewhere to say, ask your broker this, and I get, Deborah, can I file a complaint? Are they not violating something from the ethics or something? Look, if you don't know what the ethics says and you don't know what the standard practices say, how are you going to call me and say that's an ethics problem? That's a standard of practice problem. I look at the standard of ethics or standard of practice and the ethics regularly just so I can stay fresh on it. We all take it, once every 3-4 years, and most of you are just in the class so you can get past for the credit that you have to have for it. But I really do take it seriously. So I do look at it. Everything that I get a call about ethics and standard, it usually isn't. It's a personality problem. It's a I don't understand the contract problem is really what it is. And Barbara probably could chime in on that one. But let me just be clear. The only person that can file the ethics complaint is your broker, okay? And if that person you're co-oping with is not a member, then you have to report them to the Real Estate Licensing Authority, also known as GREC, or the courts, also done by your broker. So Code of Ethics and Realtor is, the Code of Ethics was set up for realtors, not salespeople. So you have to know whether the person you're co-oping with is even a realtor. Let's start there, okay? And then boards and association of realtors determine whether the Code of Ethics has been violated, not you. Hence Barbara with grievance and so on, and all the other departments that are there that work with the grievance committee. All right, does everyone understand that? I'm going to take that as a yes. So before you file an ethics complaint, boards of realtors can discipline realtors for violating code of ethics. Typical forms of discipline include attendance of courses, seminars, maybe a fine. They're not going to lose their license because the code of ethics doesn't give us our license. GREC does. They're the ones that would do a different investigation to see whether you violated something. And I just went to the broker summit a couple of weeks ago because they were trying to determine what we were going to do about teams. And I won't go into that in this call, but at the end of the day, they said that grievances, or I should say investigations, were down for salespeople and realtors and up with commercial. Okay, they're not getting as many consumer complaints. So the primary emphasis of discipline for ethical lapse is education. And it's to create a heightened awareness and an appreciation for the duties of the code that the codes impose. So before you start saying, all these different things, you don't get to file the complaint. And I know there have been agents that have threatened some of you to say, I'm going to file a complaint with the code of ethics. Okay, good luck. They don't get to do that. The broker does. So don't fall for everything you hear. Know what you know that you know, so that when someone says that, you could say, well, good for you. And let's stay focused on this transaction. You can do that after the fact. All right. Brenda, let me let you unmute and ask your questions before I get to the end here.
Well,
You remember it?
yes, I actually put it in the chat, Deborah. I was just asking.
Oh.
I think I know the answer to it in a way. I had a seller that suddenly decided to be my buyer out of the blue because he found a house that he loved, and we put an offer on it, and we did not have the earnest deposit up front. I was just notified that he has to get it from his 401k. He tells me this afterwards, so it's going to be a day late. So I'm thinking I should do the amendment, or should I do the notification form?
You do an amendment. You've got to let everybody know that. So in the event that you knew this at the beginning, there's 3 lines on the earnest money: offer date, blank days from binding, and other. So in that case, you would have used other. That the earnest money will be delivered no later than maybe 3 business days from at the release of the 401k. Because when it comes to 401k, from my corporate days, most companies only let you go into that 401k once a month or something like that. And they distribute once a month. Every corporation is different. So when you have someone that's getting money from an entity like that, whether it's 401k or a mutual fund or something like that, they can't always liquidate those funds as quickly as possible. So then what you would find out, what kind of time frame are we talking about, and put that on the contract in the other section. Because many of you see that other, but you don't know what that other means.
Yeah.
That would be an example of using other. Okay, because you could put 5 and then the 401k still hasn't sent that buyer the money. So in the case of your question, you're going to need to do an amendment to extend the earnest money delivery.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, so I'll finish in my closing remarks to say that in this Shifty business, we are looking at sellers that are thinking about selling their home still, and they want to do a compelling price, or I should say the price needs to be compelling versus aspirational. And we've been living in an aspirational world for the last, I would say, 3 years. And we need to get better pricing, better compelling pricing, and having really fierce conversations with sellers about where buyers are right now. They're looking at the interest rate. They see that, for every full percentage that interest rate went up, their ability to buy went down by $100,000. So the sellers need to understand that great pool of buyers they had at 2% just shrunk a little bit. Okay, so when they want to kind of say, well, let's try it, there's nothing wrong with trying it other than they're wasting time. But if they insist on it, give them a deadline. Let's try it for 5 days. If we don't get any looks or offers, we're too high. the market is speaking to us. Okay. And if they price it right, the buyer may look at it as a bargain and offer them over asking anyway. But you've got to explain this to them so that they start out with a compelling price and not shooting for the stars right away. All
And
right.
Deborah, can I add one more thing before you go?
Sure.
And even though the interest rates are going up, they are still historically low.
Yes. Yes. It's a shame that the news, and we always know the national news kind of skews things even bigger than what they really are. They won't say historically low. They just keep saying they keep rising and rising and rising, but they're still historically low. To get a 5% interest rate is still historically low. Talk to someone who had a 16% interest rate and they will roll their eyes at you, like, really? And there are still people out there that have those double digits as interest rates. They just never refinance for whatever reason, probably because they have very little left to pay off and it's probably going to cost them more to refinance than to just keep that low balance and pay it off. I want to encourage all of you, if you're not already subscribed to Wiseman PC on YouTube, those YouTubes come out probably once every 2 weeks. Sometimes he gets really good at it and might have 2 in 1 week. But for the most part, I'm seeing them probably every 2 weeks. When you subscribe, then your phone will bing or ding or dong and say that there's a new YouTube. If you've never been to his site on YouTube, there's probably about 65, 66 YouTubes right now. So you could kind of put them on a playlist and just go through them. Or if you are looking for something specific, you can go into the search bar right here like I did, and I typed in referral and it brought up this referral agreement because I was sending that to someone that called me this weekend. Questions? Any other questions? Anything you're going through? Thank you, Willie.
Hey, Deb, I've got to jump off the call, but I just wanted to say to everybody on this call today, Deborah did an excellent job of bringing you some great information on things that we should be using in our contracts, especially now moving forward. So I hope that everybody got something great out of this. And Deborah, thanks for doing such a great job.
Thank
Y'all
you,
have a
Tom.
good day.
Thank you. So if anybody has anything that they want us to discuss, do you know the next, I think the next one, what is today? The 11th. I think the next one's the 25th, that Monday at 12, whatever that Monday is. We do every other Monday. And Tom will be hosting that. If there's anything that we haven't covered that you really want us to cover, let us know. Really, this is an open forum for you, but sometimes because you guys are so quiet, I'll come with a subject matter or Tom will come with a subject matter. But really, this is an open forum for you to ask questions as Guy did and Brenda and some of the others. And I thank you and Stephanie, I thank you for participating. Anyone else have a question or anything they want to share? Stephanie, you have your hand up. Go ahead, unmute.
I just have a question. So I went on an appointment with an investor and he's flipping the home and he's going to be listing the home. And I guess in the crawl space, there was mold, or we don't know if it's mold yet.
Mhm.
And they're going to treat it themselves. They're not going to get a professional mold company because the mold company said that they can't treat it unless they put a vapor barrier as well. So what would be the best way for me to disclose it without getting in trouble?
Well, it's something that you know, and it could be a problem when what's going to happen, a buyer's going to do an inspection. And most likely, I hope they do an inspection. And that inspector may be good and go in the crawl space and make notification of that. And it's really going to be up to the buyer to determine, hey, seller, we want you to fix this. You basically know that it needs a vapor barrier and there's mold there. And because you do know it, if you're asked that question direct, you have to disclose it.
Okay. So if we do the seller disclosures like non-latent defects and the fixtures checklist, Would you advise us just disclosing vapor barrier was suggested and not added, or?
Well, I don't know what the house looks like. I know that it's when these older homes, you know, these 1950s and older homes, they have crawl spaces. They're susceptible to mold.
Mhm.
And so therefore, if there's no ventilation system in there or vapor barrier, it's going to come back. So your seller could easily hide it,
Mhm.
but it's going to come back. And if the buyer finds out that they knew it was there, or they find out you knew it was there, that could be an issue, but they would have to prove that. But because you know it, I would highly recommend to your seller and advise him, look, let's just do the right thing and get it done so it doesn't come back and haunt you. Because that buyer could come back and sue the seller saying, you knew this, you renovated it, why didn't you do that? Or if that buyer doesn't have a good agent to say, hey, let's make sure we check that crawl space, there's no issue there.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other last closing remarks or questions? Let me look in chat real quick. I think I got everybody. Thank you, Guy. Thanks, Barbara. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charity, Lori. Okay, guys, well, go out there. You're equipped with the Shifty business with some new tools, and we'll see you next time.